Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today what we're talking about are expireds, for sale by owners, and cold calling, and is this worth our time? As we're going through this, what you'll notice is, generally speaking, these activities are not worth our time. That's not because they don't necessarily work. It is because we can be doing things that A, are more enjoyable, and B, produce more income for us. Especially when we're thinking about this on an income per hour basis, there's just more advantageous things that we can be doing with our time. Now, if you do use these strategies, we will talk towards the end about how you can implement them into your business in a positive way. However, in most cases, these strategies tend to leave us without a ton of business, and the business that we do have, we tend to not love. So that's what we're going to discuss today. So first off, why are these strategies not necessarily worth our time? Well, one of the main reasons is because these calls are usually not well received. The person who's receiving the call from us, the for sale by owner, the expired, the cold calling prospect, these people tend to not want to hear from us. So we're actually starting from a disadvantaged state, because instead of actually this person wanting to have a conversation with us about real estate or building a relationship with this individual, it becomes a lot more convincing. We're trying to convince them. We're trying to persuade them. And this is actually making our lives a lot more challenging. Now, when we're dealing somebody like from our SOI or from our database or somebody that we know, it's a completely different sort of transaction. They are oftentimes quite open to hearing our advice. They're oftentimes quite open to working with us. And they're oftentimes a lot more open to providing us with referrals. When we're thinking about these other strategies, that's not always the case. And that starts with the fact that oftentimes when we're calling them, we're starting from a disadvantaged state because they're not well-received calls. And so this leads us into the second point, which is these calls almost by definition are transactional. Oftentimes, when we're approaching these calls, when we're calling expireds, we're calling with the intention of getting a listing. When we're calling for sale by owners, we're calling with the intention of getting a listing. Now, that in itself is an issue. This strategy can work if we change our mindset. If we change the way that we approach these calls, and instead of trying to call them with the intention of converting them, of getting a listing, and instead we're making these calls with the intention of building a relationship with them, with an intention of actually trying to help them, regardless of if they use us or not, that actually changes the whole perspective that we will have on the process. So one of the main issues here is that, generally speaking, these are transactional style ways of prospecting. Now, transactional style ways of prospecting, yes, we can do them. However, there tend to be so many better ways that we can go about building our business that's a lot more enjoyable than trying to convert people that don't want to hear from us about why they should use us to buy or sell real estate. Next, and from my perspective, the most important, is these leads tend to not be our strongest source of business. So let me expand on this a little bit further. These people, if it's an expired listing, they've already gone through a listing period and potentially, not necessarily, because who knows what sort of advice that they were getting while they were on the market, but potentially they were not receptive to the advice that came from their agent. Because if they expired, there's a good chance that there was advice that was actually communicated to them, whether that be reducing the price, changing the way the home is presented, or something else where they were not responsive to that. We are now trying to get a lead who is potentially not responsive to advice from an agent. Now, that's not always the case. I understand that. It can come from a place of, hey, the last agent just didn't provide the best advice. I get that. But generally speaking, these people may be more resistant to advice. So when we take on the client, we are basically taking on that potential issue as well. Now, the other component is there's a lot of real estate agents out there. When we have an agent with an expired listing or a for sale by owner or a cold call, and then this person is being convinced to potentially work with us, whether that be over the phone or the next step, which is actually potentially getting in the home and then converting them, these people potentially they don't have the connection with another agent. Now, that in itself is a good thing in many ways, right? Because we're putting ourselves in the position to be their agent. If that is the case, then potentially their networks are slightly smaller. A smaller network can still lead to a ton of referrals for us. However, oftentimes people that generally refer people are referred. So let me explain that further. If I am somebody who generally refers people, then that person that came to me generally is referred. Now, when it comes to cold calling expireds and for sale by owners, these people tend to not be referred and they may not refer either. Again, I understand that this is a huge generalization in many cases, but that being said, we still have to think about how we're using our time. And if we're filling our database full of people that are expireds for sale by owners and cold calling prospects, that's not to say we can't have successful businesses. However, that is to say we'll probably have a number of clients within our database that may not be our strongest clients. So we're filling our database full of potential people that may not be as strong as if we were filling our database by way of our SOI. Next, we have this concept of the illusion of building a business. So when we think about a sales-related business, we think we just have to sit there and dial and call. And really, the more calls we make, the more successful we will be. Now that is an illusion, and that is not always accurate. The more calls we make doesn't necessarily mean that our business is going to grow faster than anybody else's. Our ability to communicate is absolutely key. Our ability to form relationships in real estate is absolutely key. And that is exactly why you may look to an agent in your market who is a very high producer, potentially even top producer across the board. And maybe you do a deal with them and you're like, that agent doesn't actually know as much as I would think they would know given how successful they are. So you kind of start to think to yourself, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that individual agent, maybe they're not actually as good at real estate. Potentially they are, actually very likely they are, but they're extremely good at building relationships. And as such, their business has grown dramatically. When we are doing activities that are sitting there and just dialing the phone over and over and over again, we're playing a numbers game. And we're not actually playing the relationship game. And so our ability to go out there and connect with the public, ideally in person, also online, but in person is key. If we have the ability to do that, we can build these really strong businesses. However, if we are just calling, they don't really have the opportunity to experience our personality and to actually build a relationship with this individual because, again, it's more transactional. We are trying to get in the house to list their home. Even though a lot of the scripting out there says we have no intention of listing your home, we know for a fact, and actually the prospect does too, that you do have the intention of doing that. In a sense, we're not even being fully truthful with them when we're saying we have no intention of listing your home because, in fact, there is an intention to list their home. So we're not actually being fully truthful. And what sort of relationships really start off on a good foot when there's not actually a truthful dialogue between the salesperson and the prospect. So ultimately what this comes down to is that it's not that these strategies don't necessarily work. It's just there's so many better ways and more enjoyable ways to build our business. And that really comes down to our ability to grow our network, grow our SOI. And simply by dialing, these people, they're not always our strongest clients. And we have this illusion that we're building this business when in fact that's not always the case. Okay, so it sounds like I'm being pretty hard on these prospecting strategies. They can actually be beneficial, and it's important to understand that they can still form part of our business. And in fact, in a certain sense, there can be a lot of positives as to why they should form part of our business. But there's a difference between forming part of our business and doing this with a certain intention and then focusing our whole business on these strategies. Instead, if we want to start to integrate them into our business, that's fine, but be mindful that this should just be a component of our business. With the main component, the majority of what we do throughout our week and day is focused on growing and solidifying relationships with our SOI. That's how we're going to build these extremely strong referral-based businesses that are actually enjoyable with strong clients that we love to work with. That being said, there are some reasons why we may want to explore these strategies. Now, the first reason why you may want to explore these strategies, and this is actually an extremely good reason, and if everyone could actually do this, they would become better agents. And it's when you are starting in real estate or when you are newer in your career, that doesn't necessarily mean your first year. That could be within your first 5 years. That can even be within your first 10 years. If you're wanting to improve your ability to handle rejection, these calls can be great. Now, what I love about this strategy is when we're making these calls with the intention of trying to improve our ability to be rejected, we end up putting ourselves out there a little bit further. we end up trying to handle the objection versus just being pushovers. And so we actually improve our ability to communicate. Now, some of these will convert, most of them will not. However, it's still a successful day if we use these prospecting strategies as a way for us to build thicker skin. So if we go into these calls with the intention of getting rejected, oftentimes the calls are a lot more enjoyable. We get a little bit further with the client. And on top of that, we do improve our overall sales ability because we have to handle rejection. These calls tend to be very rejection heavy. And for that reason, we can start to build this muscle. Now, next, and along the same lines, are these calls very much help our ability to handle objections. And the reason for that is because these tend to be objection-heavy conversations. They're people that don't want to meet with us. They're people, if it's for sale by owner, there's a good chance they don't even like agents. They've actually made the conscious decision to not work with an agent. So we're going to have objections. So if we actually go to these calls with the intention of building up that thicker skin through rejection and also trying to handle objections, we get a lot of learning out of these and we grow as agents. Now, finally, it's also better than doing nothing. So if we're not going to do anything whatsoever, if we're not going to work on building our SOI, we're not going to work on strengthening relationships with our SOI, and we have no intention of doing that, this is better than just doing nothing, ultimately, right? So it is a strategy that can lead to some business. However, SOI-based strategies tend to be a lot more effective. So keep that in mind. Now, finally, a personal story, because I do have experience doing these sort of prospecting activities. I have found that for sale by owners, if we're approaching them, again, with the true mindset that we're not trying to solicit their business, which is very hard because 9 times out of 10, we can't really lie to ourselves and say we're not trying to solicit their business. But this is a very good practice if we're able to actually approach the for sale by owner without the intention of trying to list their home. I know it sounds very backwards, but if we actually can do this, what we'll notice is our conversion rate will increase. And on top of that, we'll be learning how to communicate. Because if I don't have an intention of actually listing this home, instead, I want to practice a CMA. I want to practice my communication. I want to deal with rejection. If that's more of my mindset, then I'm going to come out of this as a better agent. And instead of just looking for a deal, I'm looking to become a better agent. And that's really at the heart of this because I have prospected for sale by owners. And frankly, it's been a good strategy at times. But where it's been good is it's improved my ability to be an agent. Yes, I've listed a few of them. No, they haven't necessarily always been my strongest clients. But that being said, it has made me a better agent because of the mindset used during that approach. Now, that took me years. Off the start, that wasn't the approach. I would say I'm not looking to list their home, but in fact, of course, we always are. But when you move away from that and instead try to focus on how you can become a better agent, you are now getting all of the goods that can actually come from this strategy. Now, when it comes to expireds, I have very, very little, if any, experience with this. Our market actually does not allow prospecting for expired. So I haven't necessarily done it that frequently, but I've dealt with a lot of agents who do it. And it's very similar to for sale by owners in many ways. The only real difference when it comes to expireds is if you can prospect for expireds within your given market, those people are getting an absolute ton of phone calls in order to try and relist their home. So it's actually kind of a strategy. You have to be able to differentiate yourself from all of the noise out there. And finally, cold calling. My experience with cold calling. My experience around cold calling is more around the approach of can I find targeted accounts. So it's more account-based cold calling. So what does this actually mean? When it comes to cold calling, I'm not just going to pick up a phone book and start calling people. Instead, I'm going to strategically find people or companies that I want to work with and I want to build a relationship with them. And yes, cold calling will be part of that. So a great example is builders. If you have a builder and you think, okay, here's a number of different builders that I'd love to represent within my community, cold calling is going to form part of that blueprint, part of that strategy. Actually, we have an episode on this, on the blueprint for dealing with builders, and partly we are doing some cold calling there. But I'm not just picking up a phone book and randomly calling people. I'm being very strategic about who I'm calling, and my communication to them is very directed towards their exact business. And on top of that, there's emails, there's gift baskets that are going to them in ways to actually convert them. It's not just pure cold calling. Now, I know we've been pretty hard on these strategies, and yes, there are some positives that can come from this that we have discussed. However, they're truly just, if we're doing them in isolation, not the best use of our time, not the best way to actually grow our real estate business. And that is because a lot of these calls tend to be transactional and they're not so focused on building the relationship. And when we focus more on SOI, we're focusing a lot more on the relationship and way less on the transaction. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out anytime at revrealestateschool.com, or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.